connected to iPhone.
Thanks. Hi. So interesting thing, someone asked about my tour. This is my 11th stop on a tour of Canada. I'm doing 12 cities in Canada in 12 days. Waterloo is my last stop tomorrow, and then I return home. So it's been really excellent. I've had a really great time, and I've driven the whole way. So all the way from Vancouver to here, across all the beautiful country of West Ontario and BC and everything. So yeah, I've been having a great time. Good turnouts everywhere. Great people. I really like Canada, so I'm definitely going to come back and do another drive tour and spend even more days in each city, or at least some of the cities, as much as I can do. I'll give you a bit of a warning. So on the course of this path of driving across the country, especially with the wildfires in the west, my allergies have been acting up. So today they really attacked me. And so I took some meds, and then we noticed that they're the wrong ones. They're the sleepy, drowsy meds, and not the animated meds. So I'm struggling to be animated. No, it's actually easy because once I start speaking, I get excited by my subject, so it shouldn't be a problem. But if I seem kind of weird, that's why. It's the drugs. Anyway, so here I'm going to talk about why the Gospels are fiction. I use in formal parlance, we say myth. It really just means fiction. Not true. It's made up stuff. Now, one of the things we know about how we figure this out for other books in the ancient world is we have a variety of tests that we apply to ancient documents. I talk about these in my book, Proving History. The smell test is, does it smell? Which is the colloquial way of putting it. Formally is, does it just, the story looks really suspiciously weird. Too much weird stuff happens in it. It just doesn't look like a factual history. And that's not a very formal way to look at it, but that is one thing that historians actually do. They'll look at a text and say, no, this doesn't look like real things are happening. Another one, of course, related to that is the formal criterion of natural probability, which is that, does that actually happen in the real world? And you're looking at a story, and Jesus kills 2,000 pigs with a magic spell. Then you say, well, that doesn't happen in the real world. And I'll give you a real example later. Oh, by the way, the killing the pigs is true. He casts demons into 2,000 pigs, and they all run and drown. So Jesus killed 2,000 pigs. Anyway, doesn't happen in nature, doesn't happen in the real world, so it probably didn't happen, notwithstanding Christian apologists insisting that we should give an exception to the Gospels. No, we're going to treat them the same way we treat all other ancient texts. If Julius Caesar were to cast demons into 2,000 pigs and they ran into the sea and drowned, we would assume that story was fiction. And another one is that turns around on its head a lot of times that you hear from Christian apologists is the criterion of vivid narration. They'll say, well, this looks so vividly narrated, it sounds like they're almost there. It must be an eyewitness account. Actually, historians of antiquity, when we see vivid narration, that's usually a telltale sign it's being made up. When you're looking at like sober histories, they just report facts. This is what was written down. This is what was recorded as having happened. You don't get this detailed, vivid narrative of what's going on. We have many examples of battles being depicted where generals are having conversations in the midst of battle, like Alexander the Great, for example. We know that didn't happen. But when you have these like little particular vivid details, these are things we knew in the ancient world that authors added to add color to the story. It wasn't necessarily eyewitness detail. And another thing we apply are emulation criteria. When we see one story looks an awful lot like another story we've heard before told about someone else, that's usually a good sign that it's made up as well. And I'll be talking about some examples as we go along. The Gospels in general don't look like histories. Even if you compare them to other histories of the ancient world, they don't have these features that even ancient histories have. I mean, modern histories, of course, are much more reliable, much more detailed, have much more careful methodologies. In the ancient world, it was much more fast and loose, and we don't entirely trust all the ancient historians either. We don't think everything they wrote is true. But the Gospels are particularly bad at this. The Gospels don't name their sources. Usually ancient historians named their sources, Or they don't discuss their relative merits either. We have examples of ancient historians who not only mention who their sources are, they have like a little bit of discussion of which ones they trust more than others and why. And they explain why they're relying on these sources. So ancient histories, not all of them did this, but a lot of them did this. It was more of a typical characteristic of histories. The Gospels don't do that. You just rush in and tell stories. You have no idea who's telling the story, where it comes from, who's the witness, or whatever. The Gospels also exhibit no historiographical consciousness. In other words, they never discuss methods, like how did I figure out this was true, how did I use the sources, in what critical stance did I take, and so on. They never mention the possibility of information being incorrect or the existence of alternative accounts. There's like one exception where you have the story where supposedly the Jews made up the story that Christians stole the body, but even that is not portrayed in the same way that alternative accounts would be portrayed in ancient histories. It's just told as a...
It is common to ask what wonders we might find while exploring space, what new civilizations we might encounter, or what would the galaxy be like once we explore and colonize it if we never meet anyone else out there?
What up, everybody?
So today our topic is the future of the galaxy if humanity truly is the first technological civilization to arise in it, something we touched on briefly last year in our episode on uplifting. That was a two-part collaboration episode with John Michael Gaudien, and while with 2 episodes we got to spend more time on the topic, both John and I felt that there were a lot of implications about the future of the galaxy that we brushed against but need more explanation. We can contemplate exploring space and settling the galaxy, and what the solution to the Fermi paradox will be if we will meet anyone out there, but often what comes after gets skipped. What is the galaxy like after you've explored and settled it? What challenges does a galactic-wide civilization face, and can you even have such a thing? This is what John and I will be trying to tackle today. To do that, we must first discuss the Fermi paradox. Of course, the Fermi paradox is a familiar topic for regulars of either of our channels, but discussion tends to focus mostly on reasons why alien civilizations aren't being seen by us. The core of the Fermi paradox is that it simply seems peculiar that a universe as old and gigantic as ours could be absent of other intelligent life. It seems paradoxical. Many solutions have been proposed for handling this, but most focus on why these civilizations emerge often enough but can't be seen by us, either because they are hard to see or have ceased to exist. We spend a lot of time discussing these proposed solutions and their merits and flaws, but the alternative, that we are the first civilization to emerge in our region of the universe, is going to be our focus for today. Not so much the reasoning behind that solution, but what its consequences might be, what a galaxy might look like down the road if humanity was the first civilization to emerge, and went out and colonized the whole place and perhaps beyond. Particularly the notion that we might encounter other alien civilizations that just happen to emerge during that colonization period. As improbable as that would seem if no one else had in the billions of years before that, this scenario is actually quite likely for a given definition of the term alien. From the perspective of the Fermi paradox, this sort of scenario is possible under what is generally known as the rare Earth hypothesis. The basic notion being that while there are billions of galaxies, each host of billions of stars, resulting in billions of planets, the conditions for life to emerge on those is quite rare. This is usually broken down into the idea that life emerging might be ultra rare, that the evolutionary path to intelligence and technology might be ultra rare, or that such civilizations surviving to colonize the universe and choosing to do so is ultra rare.
But none of these are exclusive. For instance, it could be life emerging happens on maybe only 1 in a million planets, leaving millions of planets in our galaxy alone, which are inhabited or were at some point. Yet of those, perhaps the evolutionary pathway to high intelligence is so uncommon that only 1 in a million planets have achieved that thus far. It may never occur, as their sun may die or strip off their oceans or atmosphere before that happens. Or it may be that they just need more time. The universe might seem old, at nearly 14 billion years, but in truth, it is barely into the stellar era. and stars will be regularly forming for at least 1 trillion more years, and the heavier atoms needed for rocky planets and biochemistry will continue to grow more common as time goes on. If only 1 in a million planets has ever hosted life, and only 1 in a million saw it reach higher intelligence, then those two combined would make it improbable any other civilization besides our own has yet arisen in this galaxy.
These barriers to life forming and reaching intelligence are collectively referred to as filters, and we will often refer to great filters, a given filter that is particularly improbable, lottery odds. One of those that has been suggested is that even if intelligence develops fairly often, this does not necessarily lead to abstract thinking and conceptualizing, let alone serious technology. After all, there are many species on Earth that have fairly large brains, and had them as long as various hominids have, but not done much with them. Even of the hominids, humanity and its nominally extinct near-human cousins or predecessors like Neanderthal and Homo erectus sat around with brains fairly parallel to our own for many thousands of years without doing much technologically. We've had fire for around 1 million years, but using fire for pottery and metalworking are quite recent, and it is entirely possible that many civilizations never go down that higher technology pathway, rather than it being inevitable as we often think of it. Indeed, we have plenty of historical examples, all of which come from long after civilization had already embraced a lot of technology and innovation, like ancient Rome, where new technologies were simply not used, even though they knew its benefits and in no way doubted that technology's effectiveness. Quite to the contrary, they often felt using it would ultimately hurt them more than it helped. Those of us living nowadays know all too well the advantages of technology, but also its perils. And unlike our ancestors, we don't particularly have to worry about dying early of sickness, starvation, or other hardships if we decline to embrace a new one, like artificial intelligence. So if many civilizations decline to use beneficial technology, even while having to endure those hardships, it may be plausible that some opt to avoid one technology, or even all further progress, out of a fear of the consequences of using it, reasoning things are good enough as is. That fear represents one of our 2 remaining filters of the Fermi paradox humanity hasn't hit yet, that we might destroy ourselves long before colonizing other solar systems. The other one is that colonizing other systems might turn out to be impossible, impractical, or undesirable for some reason. All of these filters add into the general rare Earth hypothesis for the Fermi paradox, that the galaxy seems to be an empty place, not because we can't see other civilizations, but because there simply are not any, or the handful that exists stuck on their homeworld, or near enough that they haven't left an obvious footprint for us to detect yet. This scenario is our main focus for today, as we ask what the future will be like if it is the right solution, and those last 2 filters, self-destruction or not colonizing the galaxy, are ones we overcome. In this regard, we will also be examining why so many of the other solutions to the Fermi paradox just don't seem to work, if such civilizations are indeed common. As best as we can tell, we are not too likely to find colonizing other planets in our solar system an insurmountable barrier, or one that folks decline to do. If you can do that, then you have the option of making generational ARC ships to colonize other systems, even if you don't get far superior drives, which might let you get ships up to near light speed, or maybe even somehow surpass it with a warp drive, or wormholes or other faster-than-light FTL methods. It would also seem improbable any natural disaster could destroy your civilization at this point. As to unnatural disasters, like artificial intelligence, or humanity being replaced by cyborgs or genetically engineered superhumans, realistically, this doesn't much matter to the Fermi paradox, since you're usually just replacing one aggressive and advanced species with another that's more aggressive and advanced, and thus even better at colonizing the galaxy. Of course, you might have an AI that was non-expansionist, just taking over Earth. But if you have already colonized your solar system, that won't wipe you out, and you can just expand into the galaxy while it sits on Earth doing whatever amuses it. If we are assuming this galaxy is devoid of life, then we have the whole place to ourselves. And while those planets aren't naturally hospitable to life, there should be billions that are much easier to terraform than Mars or Venus. Alternatively,
If the galaxy isn't devoid of life, just technological civilizations, we have to decide what to do with those inhabited planets. In some ways, what we think we would like to do informs us of what aliens might do, and it's one of our approaches to the Fermi paradox. If it makes sense to us to do something, it might be likely aliens or future humanity would act that way too. Of course, there are limits on that. An alien mind is likely to demonstrate alien behavior, and it is worth remembering that while we, nowadays, can't wait to explore the cosmos and meet new civilizations and learn about them, quite a few of our ancestors would not have shared that desire entirely. Like us, they were curious, a trait we'd expect any technological civilization to share, but they might have wanted to encounter new civilizations so they could take their planets and sacrifice them all to the sun god in thanks.
In our last collaboration, we discussed the concept of uplifting, which is where you take something like a dolphin or a chimpanzee and modify it to be smarter and able to handle technology. In those episodes, we defined 3 types of uplifting: technological, physiological, and mental, none of which are exclusive either. You could encounter a species with all they need for technology except that technology, like early Homo sapiens, and technologically uplift them. For something like chimpanzees, you'd also need to mentally uplift, enhance the brains a bit. For something like dolphins, you'd need to physiologically uplift them too, giving them hands or digits on their fins to handle objects. One might opt to do all of the above, or even just one, like giving chimpanzees bigger brains but not technology, just to see if they got it on their own. This is one way in which we could encounter alien civilizations, by making them. And indeed, you might send out sophisticated probes in advance of colonization waves to do just that. We often discuss how you might colonize the galaxy by sending out automated probes to do the initial work, and it seems common sense to include an ability to detect inhabited planets so you don't end up accidentally terraforming planets some other critters already live on. Potentially, such a probe might have orders to engage in uplifting instead, or to encounter something which might make a good candidate.
As to why you might do that, we've also discussed the difficulties in quarantining a planet in the long term. Here's the problem. As we expand outward, possibly encountering inhabited but non-technological planets, we will obviously be curious about them. We also might decide we need to seal them off so nobody can exploit or tamper with them. But in the long term, that's a very hard policy to maintain. Realistically, probably an impossible one, as you'd be looking at maintaining a quarantine for potentially many millions of years before any civilizations might arise. That is a very long time to try to maintain anything unchanging, and it would only take one lapse for someone to sneak in past the quarantine and break it. We discussed the near impossibility of maintaining such a long-term quarantine in more detail in the Alien Civilization series episode, Smug Aliens. So you might decide that path of doing the least harm would be just to tell your probes to uplift anyone they encounter who is over whatever threshold you deem right, and to go ahead and terraform any planet that is just basic microbes, grabbing samples for study later. They could be a threat to you, but if your probes aren't all that far ahead of your colonization waves, it's very unlikely, even if they are given all of your technology, that they'd be some sprawling interstellar empire who could knock you over. You had a big head start after all. You're already out colonizing worlds, and your probe at most only carries the most recent technological updates it got from home, which if it is a few thousand light years away, is now as far out of date technologically as our ancestors a few thousand years ago who thought bronze was the best stuff ever. Even if they're not grateful for the boost up, any uplifted civilization we spawn would presumably be rather intimidated by their creator species, who they know already had 1 million colonized systems when the probe arrived, and whose awesome technology is probably considered antique junk by its makers. However, one hardly has to encounter aliens to do uplifting, and this is where we start needing to talk about how humanity is a fairly ambiguous term in regard to a future galactic civilization. Even if Earth is where that all starts from, which is arguably still the case if some of those life forms had originated on alien planets and had been uplifted, they're essentially the adopted children of Earth. Human, or person, or citizen are all rather hazy concepts when you start going outside a modern context. Who's more human? An alien raised on Earth who went to school here, eats our cuisine, coaches a baseball team, and watches our films and TV, or a human raised on its native planet with its customs and traditions? We could hand-wave that away by pointing to something like DNA, but a cyborg, or a human mind uploaded into an android, or just a virtual world, has no DNA. What's more, as we go out and colonize space, even if folks weren't very proactively using genetic engineering or transhumanist pathways, which they likely will, we'd diverge a lot from each other. Same as a species cut in half when a land bridge melts between two lands, living on alien worlds scattered around the galaxy is going to result in a lot of divergence. All the more so since those are alien worlds, alien suns, alien geology and weather and day length and so on. Such processes take thousands of generations, but then so too does colonizing a galaxy at sublight speeds. And again, that's under normal conditions. You start playing around with genetics and cybernetics and uplifting, especially if you're trying to adapt people to live in alien environments, and your timeline gets expedited. You could be a ship's captain who dropped some colonists off somewhere and came back to that planet 1,000 years later, expecting the colonists to have mutated a bit. You're expecting them to show some characteristics that would represent a new ethnicity, maybe with some unique phenotypes like purple hair or orange eyes, but instead find people walking around on 6 legs who insist they are human. Considering our hypothetical captain is 1,000 years old, implying life extension technology, someone might come out to greet us from the original colonists, still looking fairly human perhaps, and shooing off their 6-legged great-grandchildren. Indeed, things are just as likely to be changed back on Earth, if not more so. Colonies might be loaded up with adventurous mindsets, but they'd still only possess a small fraction of Earth's diversity and technological might. You get back to Earth and send a report to the Secretary General about how disturbed you are at the 6-legged humans, and he might reply back with a note sharing your concerns and asking to meet to discuss it in person. You go see him and are rather taken aback to see a dolphin, and when you let your surprise slip, he reacts angrily and demands to know what you have against Europans. Uplifted dolphin cyborgs having been around Earth and the various icy moons of our solar system so long it doesn't even occur to him that you're a speciesist. So he just assumes you're angry about someone whose family migrated from Jupiter's moon Europa being the Secretary General of Earth. If you headed off to the Orion Nebula, a mere 1,300 or so light years away, practically in our backyard in galactic terms, you might meet humans who looked entirely human, but had assimilated into the culture of the Orions, once raccoon-like creatures they'd uplifted, and who modified themselves to be human form, but kept their basic culture and brain architecture, and who hated modern Earthers as physiologically impure. 10,000 years ago, they were animals running around forests, and 8,000 years ago, they were smart raccoons learning technology from their human friends, and decided to tinker with themselves to look more humanoid, and became so obsessed with that body type as a sign of civilization that they eventually became entirely human in appearance, and are disgusted by anyone who isn't. Off on some other world, people didn't uplift dolphins or chimpanzees. They modified themselves into them and just kept their brains. They revealed the animal form but wanted to keep the intelligence. Or maybe they meant to, but that decayed. And now the Orions come by, see chimp-like primitives already somewhat humanoid, figure this is some planet that got quarantined rather than uplifted, and uplift them steadily into more human mind and form, and teach them to loathe the non-humanoid, exactly opposite their ancestors' beliefs. And again, it doesn't matter if we encounter primitive alien life or not. Things like this can just happen by the sheer weight of time and distance to diverge. Indeed, even that distance might not matter much. You could easily see a far wider spectrum of divergence just inside a single solar system as time marches on. Time, in terms of the astronomical scale, is always hard to put into perspective. This is probably why so many sci-fi settings take place a few centuries to a few millennia ahead in time. But imagine for the moment that humanity sets off its first wave of colony ships in the year 2500, and that those move outward in an expanding sphere at about 10% of light speed. When you're going that slow, you don't bypass any system that is reasonably hospitable in search of close parallels to our own. So by the year 3000, you've settled everything within 50 light years, a speck so small it wouldn't even appear as a single pixel on a galactic map. And yet, there are about 2,000 stars in this volume, enough to make an empire already dwarfing most interstellar empires we see in fiction. And that's assuming they are only doing planets, not the various space habitats we'd expect as precursors to Dyson swarms and Kardashev 2 civilizations. By 3500 AD, they are out to 100 light years and something like 16,000 stars. By 4000 AD, they are 150 light years out, a sphere now just big enough to be a pixel or two on a galactic map, and continue over 50,000 stars. They are now as far ahead from us as we were to the early Roman Empire, and likely a lot more diverged from us and each other, likely a lot more different than modern Italy is from Spain or England, both prior colonies of Rome. Even the nearest of those stars is suffering far more communication and travel lag than any of those three countries ever had from each other. Most people, incidentally, probably still live back around our original star at this point, for although they have 50,000 other stars to call home. It is far easier to build artificial habitats around your own star than colonize worlds around others. And by now, even assuming they still stick to something recognizably humanish in appearance and manner, they could easily house 10 quadrillion people, simply by having the population double every century. And they'd still be nothing approaching a genuine Kardashev 2 civilization, which could easily house 1,000 times that population. That's hardly fast growth either. Humanity quadrupled in the 20th century after all, hitting 6 billion right before the end of the millennia. It is 27% higher 18 years later, at 7.6 billion in 2018. But by the year 5000 AD, they might have reached that full Kardashev 2 status back around Earth and our solar system, 10 million trillion people. While off on the leading edge of colonization, they have reached 250 light years out. Still a tiny dot on the galactic map, but one containing 250,000 stars. But back near Earth, things are already massively diverging. 1 trillion massive habitats, each effectively its own large island in space, is fertile ground for divergence of every aspect of mind and body. Even if things are peaceful and moving slowly, you'd expect to see thousands of those habitats where folks had focused on marine life, possibly had gills added, be it cybernetic or genetic. Others where they'd modified themselves to low or no gravity and live in giant bubbles of air with floating homes and ecology adapted to drift around the endless sky. One who sneered at biology in favor of a pure cybernetic existence, or abandoned the physical entirely to live inside entire moons converted into computers, whose interior virtual landscape is so immense it would dwarf even a classic Dyson sphere. They might be a small minority of civilization at this time, but each of those factions outnumbers humanity of the 21st century by an order of magnitude at least, and indeed all the colonies combined, who themselves have precious little in common with each other. Now things change, and the classic image of sci-fi space opera totally shatters. In 5000 AD, the solar system is finally maxed out in population, and the earliest colonies are probably filling up the original worlds. Even now, every single colony, 250,000 systems, contains not even a single % of humanity, even if they've been breeding at a ferocious rate. This is still the early days of colonization. We are not even 1% done with the timeline for colonizing the galaxy, and have not even 1% of people living outside our native solar system. And yet already we see an inevitable divergence, with countless factions back around our sun waiting to branch out even further, and 250,000 sapling civilizations beginning to grow and branch out themselves, to envelop their own sun and to spread to new ones, even as in all likelihood, vast armadas of colony ships launched from way back at Earth continue to head out further. You are still nothing like a galactic civilization, and you already face so much time lag and divergence that any concept like a unified civilization is nigh impossible. And yet we've only begun to explore the scenarios and challenges for a galaxy-spanning humanity. John and I will continue that in part 2 over on his channel. Trying to wrap your mind around just how big the galaxy is, let alone the universe, is very difficult. And I think it's what damages a lot of science fiction that tries to paint a portrait of interstellar civilizations and our galaxy. They are not absorbing the sheer scale of things and the implications of what it would mean to civilizations. If you'd like to get a better grasp on the sheer scope of the galaxy and the universe beyond, then I'd recommend the course Sizing the Universe over at Brilliant.org. That will walk you through both the history of attempts to do it and our various methods for estimating size and distance nowadays, and will give you a much more intuitive feel for the scope of interstellar space, and why so many forced glances at interstellar civilizations in fiction don't hold up well when taking into account those enormous quantities of stars spread over vast amounts of space and time. Any would-be space colonist is going to have to adjust their thinking to appreciate that enormity, and if you want to learn how to quickly understand it yourself, go to brilliant.org/Isaac Arthur and sign up for free. And also, the first 200 people that go to that link will get 20% off the annual premium subscription. Okay, next week we will be a little closer to home as we return to our discussion of orbital infrastructure in the Upward Bound series to explore the possibilities of transferring power down to Earth via power satellites. We were talking about colonizing our region of the galaxy today in Part 1 and how it would require immense numbers of ships. And we will be looking at those armadas of colony ships 2 weeks from now in Exodus Fleet. If you haven't already headed off to watch Part 2, there is a link on the end screen at the end of this video and one below in the video description. If you enjoy this episode, please like it and share it with others. And don't forget to subscribe to both my channel and John's for alerts about when new episodes come out. And I'll see you again in just a minute in Part 2.
This is part 2 of another collaboration with Isaac Arthur. To see part 1 of this collaboration and links to our previous collaboration about the concept of uplifting, check out the end screen of this video or in the description below. In part 1, Isaac covered the idea of the Fermi paradox and how it may come to an eventual end, not because of alien civilizations, but our own colonization of the galaxy and what might result from that. In essence, as Isaac covered, our colonies would rapidly diverge until they no longer recognized each other as having once been the same species. Perhaps in time they might even forget that they were ever related. An explosion of intelligence may be the end result for the Milky Way, all of it unaware that it began with one species on Earth. But there is another option. Say everyone chose to remain human, or at least desired to maintain some form of a cohesive galactic human civilization. One of the fundamental problems facing a galactic humanity are the distances involved. The Milky Way is incomprehensibly huge. It takes light over 100,000 light years to cross it. Given the science that we know right now, there doesn't seem to be a way to travel faster than light, and anything that might circumvent that speed limit usually requires some form of exotic matter that we're uncertain is even possible to create. Assuming faster than light travel is not possible, the limits of the speed of light don't just constrain travel, it also constrains communications times. In this universe, information does not appear to be transmissible faster than light. If that proves to be the absolute case, then any galaxy-spanning civilization would have seemingly impossible issues to deal with when communicating. If you are 50,000 light years away from another group of humans you wish to talk to, and you used radio for communications, you would need to send out your message and then wait for them to receive it 50,000 years later, and then you'll get a message back after about 100,000 years.
Not a brisk conversation at all. And, barring any sort of advances such as uploading ourselves into machines or extending human lifespans to thousands of years or more, this is probably a deal killer as far as any meaningful communications go. Without advanced technologies that can change the very basis of who we are, our nature as biological beings, communications would be arduous. With advanced technologies, this equation changes, but time is still a factor. Human cultures can change very dramatically over the course of 100,000 years. Look at our own civilization. That long ago, we were hunter-gatherers with very little in the way of technology, In the intervening time, we have learned to construct telephones, selectively breed plants in order to turn a wild plant into something that can be grown in large-scale agriculture, or, ultimately, launch a rocket, all of which have dramatically changed the cultures that adopted them.
But imagine if we took one of those early humans from 100,000 years ago and showed them a cornfield. It would look like nothing they've ever seen. Rows of plants they probably wouldn't recognize from the forms they might have known them back in ancient times had they lived in the right part of the world where they were indigenous. Something so simple as a tomato would be unrecognizable to a person in Central America that knew its predecessor, a jungle plant with berry-sized fruits, much less someone born thousands of miles away and wholly unfamiliar with the plant. As Isaac and I mentioned in our previous collaboration on uplifting, there are currently primitive humans on Earth that have no contact with the rest of the world. We used the example of the inhabitants of North Sentinel Island in the Indian Ocean, who have rebuffed all attempts at contact, and reasonably so. They have had a bad history with the outside world's attempts at contacting them. But the truth is, in a sense, they do have one form of contact. Our flotsam and shipwrecks do show up on their shores, and they are thought to fashion arrowheads and tools from them. Perhaps they know more about us than we do them. But imagine showing them a rocket launch, something far removed from anything they've ever seen. It would be utterly incomprehensible to them. Or take our antibiotic drugs that cure illnesses that they might have considered absolutely fatal. Would they consider them magic? We simply would not be able to communicate to that person just what the rocket or an antibiotic is because we are so culturally divergent. And that's assuming you can even understand their language. Language tends to diverge when contact between peoples that speak it become isolated from one another. An example here would be the Roman Empire. While that empire was never completely culturally homogeneous, they had ethnic groups and local dialects. In fact, huge portions of it spoke Greek. In the West, large parts of it spoke Latin. But by the time of the end of the Western Roman Empire, that Latin had begun to diverge locally and become what is now modern French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian. It was only a matter of centuries before separation caused distinct, standalone languages to form out of Latin.
In an age of technology, this does not happen so rapidly because of how interconnected everything becomes. But when one introduces the level of separation you would have on a galactic scale, this all may become a problem again, and languages between colonies may begin to diverge quickly. At some point, they will no longer be mutually intelligible, and with enough time could become indecipherable. So how do cultures separated by tens of thousands of years in time understand each other at all? The only way would be some form of intentional social cohesion built in from the start. But worse off than language is any hope of galactic governance over a distance. You can't wait 10,000 years for a legal ruling or political directive from Earth. Or worse, you can't wait for funding from Earth to arrive to cover your emergency asteroid deflection project. As a result, it's hard to envision any kind of empire that could ever span a galaxy, but rather a rule where all governance must necessarily be local. But with that comes varied laws, where chewing gum might be illegal on one world, or may be compulsory on another world that manufactures chewing gum.
We see this here on Earth, where every country has different laws, some of them very different from one another. But then, there have in the past been attempts to create law codes that cover multiple lands, such as English common law, or the various imperial legal codes of the past. This could hypothetically be applied to a galactic humanity where certain situations, such as uplifting animals to be more intelligent, is banned galaxy-wide for ethical reasons. Or the creation of dangerous machine superintelligence, which might then threaten the entire galaxy should anyone create it. Perhaps there are technologies so dangerous that such a system to control them must be put into place, making some form of contact an imperative. Perhaps this could be accomplished through a network of von Neumann probes that wander the galaxy performing inspections for some central authority. Perhaps they sit in all human systems from the moment the colony is established in order to EMP that civilization back to the Stone Age should they try to pursue certain banned technologies. Such a probe could also serve as a kind of galactic law code, along with preserving an official language. Or it could be beamed out via a radio beacon, just to keep a unifying galactic reference point going for the cultures within it. Even though those cultures may no longer be in direct contact with each other, you might position many such beacons at strategic intervals so that the entire galaxy is covered to act as a sort of galactic constitution that's set during the period of initial colonization and then adhered to indefinitely once the colonies have matured. That might help to prevent dangerous technologies from arising. But what of wars between the human colonies? We're humans after all, and whenever humans from different groups came into contact for the first time, wars have tended to break out. But creating a standard on how to moderate disputes between neighboring star systems, a kind of galactic United Nations could be set up that can locally moderate disputes without the need to consult planets thousands of light years away. Or perhaps even a standardized law code kept on artificially intelligent computers that cannot be altered, and always issues sound judgments. But would humans even still go to war in space? As I said earlier, the Milky Way is enormous, and that may change the equation for conquest and warfare. In past wars, conquest was usually over a border dispute or a desire to expand. This may not be the case for space, especially when one factors in the problem of population and colonizing the Milky Way. Predicting what population will do in the future is tricky. It can go up, and currently is, but it can also go down. If it goes down for us at some point over the next century or two, and the rates of growth are indeed showing a decline, then we cannot physically colonize the galaxy at all, because frankly, we don't have enough humans. The current population of Earth, about 7.4 billion people, is utterly insufficient to colonize a galaxy made up of 100 billion stars. When you have so much real estate, far more than anyone can use, would there be a need for warfare? One would hope not. The idea of things like arms races involving superintelligent machines, nickel Dyson beams, and self-replicating berserkers are unsettling at best. Entire colonies destroyed by gray goo nanotechnology by another colony that they've been in slow motion conflict with for thousands of years. Whether possible or not, those kinds of things do not constitute a positive human future. But that brings up another thing that we humans certainly like to do: trade. What would trade look like should we colonize at least part of the Milky Way? The answer could possibly be not much. Crossing great distances, light years, just to trade scrap iron between star systems with no shortage of iron of their own makes no sense. It's simply too energy costly to trade goods in a sense like that. One exception to this, however, might be cultural goods. If someone were wealthy enough and wanted a certain painting or object from another human colony and was willing to pay tremendously for it, it can hypothetically be done, of course. But real trade would likely remain confined to the transmission of information, perhaps newly developed technologies, or the schematics for the latest asteroid blaster from a colony a few tens of light years away. Future trade could be more about what an object means rather than what it's made of. But what facilitates that trade? Would that information flow freely, or would you have to maintain an electronic currency system so people can obtain the latest galactic bestsellers and be sure the author is paid? What would back that currency? Or would it simply be a fiat currency backed by the governments of the colonies? Or, should population end up being an issue, do we ultimately choose to be a stay-at-home civilization, colonizing only the solar system itself, either because there is no need to do more, such as if our population were low, or that it's simply too daunting of a task to colonize much past a few close star systems? In that sense, the solution to the Fermi paradox is simply that alien civilizations never need to become Kardashev Type 3 civilizations that are easily visible. Rather, they may be more compact and much harder to spot.
So far, we've taken this from the perspective that we are alone in the Milky Way. But a further question to ask would be, what if we aren't, and we begin to run across other intelligent civilizations looking into ways to integrate into our expanding galactic civilization? Perhaps we find them stranded on an ocean planet that they can't escape, and we uplift them from bad physiology. How would we interact with them? Would they wish to obtain cultural artifacts of us? Would obtaining alien artifacts be worth the energy to bring them back to Earth?
In other words, maybe we will solve someone else's Fermi paradox as we fill the galaxy with our civilization. The human race might be the great lawgivers of the galaxy, expanding and uplifting more primitive civilizations than ourselves. If the solution to the Fermi paradox, for example, is that intelligence is not rare, simply that intelligence that can escape its own planet is rare, then this might come to be the case. Or maybe this exists already, and we are like the Sentinelese of the Milky Way. The aliens may not communicate with us simply because they don't know how. Perhaps contact is futile and expensive, and perhaps dangerous for us. As contact with us is dangerous for primitive uncontacted tribes on Earth due to a lack of immunity to our diseases, perhaps other civilizations in the Milky Way simply stay at home and only initiate contact if it's necessary to do so. The solution to the Fermi paradox here being that we simply aren't valuable or interesting enough yet. What do we offer an advanced alien civilization? If they're more advanced, it's hard to imagine that we offer much of anything, especially if we're dealing with a machine civilization rather than a biological one. But once we do offer something, or we run into a civilization as we colonize, we may get blindsided by communications. And therein is a question. What happens if the first communication we receive from an alien civilization is a code of rules and laws and the word conform? Figuring out the basics of what would be needed to explore and colonize the galaxy is challenging. While we haven't yet seen firsthand what the logistics of colonizing the galaxy look like, as we covered in this video, this was but a taste of what we do know. For a more in-depth look at the realities of exploring and eventually colonizing suitable exoplanets, I'd recommend the course Astronomy Worlds Beyond Earth over at Brilliant.org, where you will learn in depth through exercises how to calculate and determine the habitability zones around stars where Earth-like planets suitable for human colonization might lie, and exercise and improve your math skills in the process. You'll also learn how astronomers discover exoplanets in the first place, by exploring the transit method and looking for the gravitational wobbles planets produce on their parent stars. And finally, a segment covering the basics of interstellar travel to help you get a better feel for the realities of exploring and colonizing the Milky Way. Check that out over at brilliant.org/JMG. Thanks for listening. I am John Michael Godier.
And I'm Isaac Arthur, and we hope you enjoyed this collaboration.
And be sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channels for more futurism, science, and whatever may await us in this amazing universe in which we live.
graphics, the characters.
The gameplay is
Ancient Aliens is an American television series which premiered on April 20th, 2010 on the History Channel. The program presents the so-called ancient astronaut theory, which is the idea that extraterrestrials visited the Earth in the ancient past, and that historical text, archaeological records, and various legends contain evidence of this contact. I used to believe that the ancient astronaut theory was true. I spent years learning about it from the popular authors, from video presentations and radio shows. I was an enthusiastic promoter of this idea to my friends and family. Although I no longer feel that way, I want you to know that I have no personal reasons to reject this theory. My current worldview could easily accommodate the existence of extraterrestrials. I hope you will come away from this film, even if you disagree with it, saying that I fairly reviewed the claims of ancient aliens without bias and with respect. I hope to show you that this is not a matter of ancient aliens getting a few details wrong here and there, and their main premise remaining true. That is not an option in my opinion. I hope to demonstrate to you that they are wrong not on some, but on every single point where they assert an ancient astronaut theory to explain evidence, and that often they are using deceptive means to do this, and sometimes even fabricating evidence to make their points, as we will see. I would also like the viewer to know that unlike many skeptics of the ancient astronaut theory, I actually concede that something out of the ordinary could have occurred in the ancient past, and that there are certain consistent themes in ancient mythologies and the like that require good explanations. But I think you will quickly see that the ancient astronaut theories do not explain this evidence. You will notice a number that appears periodically on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen throughout this film. This number will appear when I am making a claim that requires a reference in order to back it up, and it will correspond to a number on the companion website ancientaliensdebunked.com. This film is divided into 3 main sections, and each topic can be viewed independently at the website if you choose. I will occasionally be joined by commentary from Dr. Michael Heiser, one of the few actual scholars who has been willing to interact with the ancient astronaut theory. Dr. Heiser has been one of the most articulate proponents of the skeptical viewpoint of this theory, and has written papers and books, as well as almost a dozen websites on the issues we will be covering in this film. We are happy to have him as a part of this film, and we're happy to have you, the viewer, here as well. I encourage you to have an open mind and enjoy the film.
Puma Punku is so unique in the way that it was constructed and shaped and positioned that it is the most intriguing ancient site on the planet.
While the pyramids at Giza are incredible feat of achievement, compared to Puma Punku, the pyramids are child play. In my opinion, the most significant piece of evidence that we have in this entire ancient astronaut puzzle is Puma Punku in the highland of Bolivia.
Well, if Puma Punku is considered such good evidence for the ancient astronaut theory, we should probably start off by looking at it. After all, it's the one that they say was built directly by extraterrestrials.
Puma Punku is the only site on planet Earth that, in my opinion, was built directly by extraterrestrials.
Ancient Aliens starts off with a false dilemma by making people think that it was absolutely impossible for ancient people to construct Puma Punku, even to the point of making outright false claims.
One of the most intriguing things there is that the stones that were used there aren't sandstone, they're granite and diorite. The only stone that's harder than diorite is diamond. So the only way that this could have been achieved is if the tools were tipped with diamonds.
This is funny because it's totally wrong. The stones are not granite or diorite at Puma Punku. They are red sandstone and andesite. But this is also funny because of the way that he says it.
The stones that were used there aren't sandstone, they're granite and diorite.
Well, yeah, actually, it is sandstone. You can't blame him, though. It becomes obvious that throughout the series, he often just repeats things he's heard in Eric von Daniken's books. Von Daniken's books are what the Ancient Aliens series is based on. Later, we see Eric von Daniken himself make the exact same, totally wrong claim.
Of course made out of stones found on Earth, because you don't transport granite or diorite from another solar system.
Von Daniken continues building up this false dilemma.
One of these platforms is 800 tons.
This is very incorrect. The heaviest block at Puma Punku is 130 tons, and most of the stones are much smaller than that, so he's off by a whopping 670 tons. Unfortunately, we will come to expect this kind of thing from Von Daniken as we progress. Ancient Aliens spends quite a lot of time pointing out the various features in the stonemasonry at Puma Punku, and then declaring it impossible to do without power tools.
Each of these small drill holes are basically evenly spaced along this routed groove. To me, it's clear that power tools have been used on this unusual block of stone.
Well, exactly. This surface is as smooth as a tabletop, like in your kitchen. There's no wave to it or anything. This was machined.
The sandstone and andesite stones at Puma Punku would have been easily worked with the most basic stoneworking tools. The idea that diamond-tipped power saws were needed is ridiculous. The red sandstone was relatively soft and easy to work with, and even though andesite is pretty hard, because of the way it cooled, it could easily be flaked off using stones as soft as 5.5 on the Mohs scale. Such pounding stones were found all over the andesite quarries in the area. Contrary to Ancient Aliens' claims that archaeologists are baffled by Puma Punku, archaeologists know the basics about how Puma Punku's stones were cut and shaped. This is partly because there is evidence for this all over the site itself. They actually used a method that almost all ancient stoneworkers used. They used hard pounding stones to pound out trough-like depressions. Later on, they used flat stones and sand to grind the stone to make a polished surface. We will see later on that this is also how the Egyptians, thousands of years before this, made their flat-surfaced granite monuments like obelisks. Sand, as we will see later when we look at Egypt, has extremely hard particles in it, and if placed between a flat surface and a rock, can polish even the hardest stones known to man. In fact, the harder the stone is, the better it can be polished using sand. We will also see how sand can turn a piece of copper into a very efficient granite saw or granite drill, a method which the Egyptians utilized quite well. Some stones at Puma Punku that Ancient Aliens would never show the cameras are the ones that are in the middle of this process. They show that at the same time a stone was being pounded by stone hammers, which created these trough-like depressions, the grinding and polishing was taking place on the other end of the stone. Unfinished stones like this one clearly show how they were shaped, and it wasn't with lasers. There's also unmistakable evidence of stone hammers having been used in places that were never meant to be visible, like where certain stones would be connected with one another. And because of that, it's hard for me to believe Eric von Daniken in this next clip, because it would mean that the alien toolbox had a laser gun right next to a stone hammer.
Extraterrestrials arrive. The spaceship stands in orbit. Only a smaller space vehicle comes down like a space shuttle. So, just to protect their instruments, they make overnight, with their technology, what we call a base camp. Of course made out of stones found on Earth, because you don't transport granite or diorite from another solar system. And then they disappear. But the wall of their base camp is still there.
It is true that stone tools would not be enough to construct Puma Punku, especially for some of the finer points. For that, they would need metal chisels and the equivalent of a carpenter's square. Entire studies have been done detailing how these cuts were made, and nothing spectacular is required except some metal tools like chisels. The arguments against this are usually either that a particular culture did not yet know how to cast metals, or that copper chisels would have been too weak. On the first point, we know that the pre-Incan Andean culture was very skilled at fashioning metals and creating metal alloys. In fact, the people who built Puma Punku were even pouring copper alloys into molds right on site, showing that they had more than enough capability to form all kinds of metal tools. But the question is, what about the tool's strength? Well, even if they were pouring pure copper into a mold, it would still work, but it would need sharpening often. But because archaeologists actually found a few of these metal cramps used by them on site, we now know that they were using a very strong copper arsenic nickel alloy, which made a much stronger final product. Arsenic acts as a deoxidant, preventing the metal from becoming too brittle, and nickel was used in copper alloys specifically to make strong chisels. Once you understand that they had the ability to make strong metal tools in a huge variety of shapes, there is no part of Puma Punku's stonework that would have been too difficult for them. Well, what about these 90-degree right angles that ancient aliens make so much about?
One of the amazing things here at Puma Punku is the precision of the blocks. You can see with this block of granite that it's really been cut at very accurate right angles.
To make flat surfaces with right angles, you don't need alien technology. You only need a square or a simple equivalent. It's important to keep in mind that Puma Punku would have been built thousands of years after the Egyptians, who had all kinds of squares and plumb bobs and levels and so on. It's a pretty basic stoneworking tool. That being said, despite what Ancient Aliens says, Puma Punku is not all perfect right angles. You can even see this, ironically enough, as the Ancient Aliens crew goes around with carpenter's squares. You can see that some of them are simply not square. Also, they make claims like all the H blocks are the same dimensions, which they say suggests that they were made by a big machine. But not only would that not be the only conclusion if it were true, it's not even true. The dimensions of the H blocks are not all the same, though they are close. It's probably the case that they were made using the same plans. Speaking of plans,
mainstream archaeologists say that Puma Punku was built by the Aymara Indians. And we would all have to agree that in order to build something like Puma Punku, you need writing, you need planning, and you need some sort of a idea where which piece goes and how it ultimately all fits together. But there is one thing that all the mainstream archaeologists agree upon, that the Aymara didn't have any writing. So how is it possible that they built all of this without plans?
the builders of Puma Punku may not have had an alphabet, but they did use the common iconography or artwork of their culture called Yanomama. All the icons on the site are Yanomama, not secret alien code, and this is but one of the many indications of the culture and time that it was built. But my point is that like many cultures, they used pictures instead of an alphabet, and most building plans are done through pictures, like blueprints, for example. So saying that no alphabet means no planning is pretty ridiculous in my opinion. Well, what about moving the stones and lifting them into place? Surely that would have required levitation.
How these massive blocks of granite were moved from their quarries and brought here to Puma Punku would have required some kind of super technology. Levitation and anti-gravity. Huge lifting vehicles. Something that ancient aliens would have had.
If they did know how to levitate these stones, then they put far too much effort into creating places in the stones to attach ropes to. Many stones at Puma Punku have grooves several centimeters in width and depth on two adjacent faces for holding ropes. They even had special places cut into the stones that Puma Punku scholars call hoisting grips. All very strange things to do if they could simply levitate these blocks. And to make matters worse for the ancient astronaut theory here, according to archaeologist Jean-Pierre Pratzen, who is an expert on Pumapunku, there is almost no stone at the Pumapunku site that does not have what he calls drag marks on one of its faces, where it has been, well, dragged to the site. Ancient Aliens throws up another false dilemma here.
What nobody talks about is the irrefutable fact that we are at an altitude of 12,800 feet, which means we are above the natural tree line. No trees ever grew in that area, meaning no trees were cut down in order to use wooden rollers. The wooden roller theory falls by the wayside.
This is like saying that there's no way that the Egyptians used wood because trees didn't grow in Egypt, which is true. The difference is that while the Egyptians had to import wood from places like Lebanon, it would have been far easier for those at Pumapunku to solve this problem. All they would have had to do is simply walk down the hill a little bit. Okay, well, what about this claim?
Logic does not exist at Pumapunku because there we have megalithic structures which just lie about this entire site as if ripped apart by some sort of a great force.
I propose that logic still exists at Pumapunku, and that the scattered state of the complex can easily be explained. Quoting from archaeologist Alexei Vranich, quote, "The high quality of the stones made it attractive building material for houses, churches, plazas, bridges, even railways." In other words, the stones were pulled down and hauled off by locals for building material. In fact, we have the 400-year-old writings of a visitor to Pumapunku who said that the looting was in full swing even back then. He wrote that if the site was closer to town, he didn't think there would have been any stones left at all. Ancient Alien says that Pumapunku is 17,000 years old. This is what Vranich said of this claim. Quote, "The idea that Tiwanaku is 14,000 years old is based on a rather faulty study done in 1926. Since then, there has been a huge quantity of work, both on the archaeology and the geology of the area, and all data indicates that Tiwanaku existed from around AD 300 to 500. For more information on the faulty study he's referring to here, I will quote at length from Jason Colavito, who has been debunking ancient astronaut theories for years in his books and blogs. He said the following about this claim. Quote, "Tiwanaku is not 17,000 years old. This date derives from the work of Arthur Poznański, who tried to apply archaeoastronomy to the site, but did so in ways that modern scholars do not recognize as legitimate. Poznański proposed a date of 15,000 BP, before present, i.e. 13,000 BCE, which the geniuses on Ancient Aliens misread as 15,000 BCE, adding an extra 2,000 years onto Poznański's already flawed dates. Here's what he did wrong. Poznański assumed that the Kalasasaya temple at Tiwanaku was laid out with perfect accuracy to align to the equinoxes and solstices that he felt but could not prove were important to the Tiwanaku people. Thus, on a certain day, the sun was supposed to rise above one rock at the temple and set behind another. But which rock should we choose? Since the current ruins do not align with these celestial events accurately, he concluded that the ruins must have been built at a time when they would have aligned with that event. Since the sun and sky change positions at a predictable rate due to the gradual changes in the angle of the Earth's axis, he concluded that the Kalasasaya temple was built in 13,000 BCE as a solar observatory, despite no other evidence of solar astronomy at the site. The long and the short of it is that Poznański assumed celestial alignments and assumed flawless construction, and then used his assumptions to prove that his assumptions were correct. Colavito also has this picture of the site with the caption, "Pick a rock, any rock, one of them must align with something." This site has been dated using a huge variety of methods, things like carbon dating, the type of metals they used, the debris found in certain places, the type of iconography they used. Literally every kind of dating method applied comes to the same conclusion. It was constructed in the early Middle Ages. Before we conclude this section on Pumapunku, there are two other claims I wanted to address.
The Spanish conqueror asked the Inca, the people living there, including the king of the Inca, "What is this Pumapunku?" and they all said, it's not us, it's not our forefather who make this. This were made by the gods in one single night. Usually a king is proud about what his people did, about the precision and so on. In that case, the chief and the people said, no, it was not us, it was the gods who made it.
If you understand a little about the Incan imperial system and religion, you will understand why the Incans didn't claim the site, and even why they claimed that it had a supernatural origin. Part of the Incan state religion was that the Incan Empire was the first civilization, and it was created by God himself. It was a very convenient idea for bolstering the Incan case for the right to rule everyone else. When the Incans arrived at Pumapunku, the site had already been abandoned for at least 100 years. Admitting that there was a pre-Incan culture at all, let alone one with more skill than them, would have been detrimental to the whole scheme. So they slightly modified their already existing mythology to include Pumapunku. So instead of Viracocha creating the Incan capital, he also created Pumapunku. And just like that, the Incans were still the oldest and greatest civilization, even though everyone probably knew it wasn't true. And finally, Ancient Aliens says the following about what the ancient local people believed regarding who constructed Pumapunku.
Local legends suggest that Tiwanaku was built as a site of religious pilgrimage to celebrate the arrival of sky gods.
But this is a total lie. Viracocha came from the sea, not from the sky. This is a very sneaky move by Ancient Aliens, in my opinion. So, in conclusion, the stones are not made of granite and diorite. The stones were easily workable with the tools available to the Andean culture, tools which we know included high-quality metal alloyed chisels. These tools would have been more than sufficient to make the angles seen at Pumapunku. The faces of the rocks have been finished using a polishing technique after being rough cut using stone hammers, evidenced by the unfinished stones and hidden areas of the finished stones. The moving of the stones was not as difficult as Ancient Aliens makes it seem, especially when you take into account that they are telling people that the stones weigh 600 tons more than they actually do. The stones have telltale drag marks and hoisting holes for ropes, all showing that they were not levitated as Ancient Aliens would have us believe. We know the culture which built this monument, and all the iconography and sculptures are consistent with that culture, and the various methods of dating that scientists use all point to the same time period. The idea that Pumapunku was from Atlantean times we now know is based on a very transparently flawed presupposition.
Perhaps the most familiar and most mysterious megalithic structure in all the world is the Great Pyramid of Giza. The enormous size and weight of the stones, multiplied by the sheer number of them, makes one thing certain. The construction of the Great Pyramid remains one of the greatest marvels and mysteries of architectural engineering.
The pyramids at Giza are marvels of engineering, and there are many theories about how they were constructed, from the mundane to the fantastic.
There are all kinds of theories on how the Great Pyramid of Giza was built. So many theories, you just sit back and shake your head. And that includes ET visitations, levitating the blocks with some kind of sound system.
One place we can learn a lot about Egyptian stone cutting methods is from the so-called unfinished obelisk. Here we have a 1,000-ton obelisk made of granite, which was abandoned midway through the project because of a crack that developed. This stone, because it is unfinished, gives us direct insight into how they cut and shaped granite, as well as other stones. On the sides, we can see how these stones were separated from the quarry. A team of workers would line up side by side and pound their sections with a diorite pounding stone. Such pounding stones can be found all over this and other quarries in Egypt. This pounding only broke off millimeters of granite at a time, but eventually these trough-like sections emerged at each worker's station. After that, they would do the same thing on the bottom of the block, until it was supported only by a thin spine in the middle. Then it would be snapped off using levers. The people who created the Moai statues at Easter Island used very similar methods for quarrying stone, as did many other groups around the world, as we will see. After the stones had been roughly shaped using pounding stones, they would then begin to polish them with grinders. There have been many types of stone grinders or polishers found in ancient Egypt. They usually had a handle with a flat surface, which they would use to rub against the stone with sand as the abrasive. They were, well, sanding the stone. The various mineral particles found in sand are hard enough not only to polish hard stones like granite, but also to do what Ancient Aliens tries to make people think is utterly impossible. That is, to cut granite. The Egyptians had a variety of ways to cut granite, mostly involving copper and sand. There are plenty of saw marks on granite stones in Egypt, at the granite quarries, of course, as well as certain notable ones, like the famous granite sarcophagus in the Great Pyramid. The person who was doing the sawing on the sarcophagus sawed for a while at the wrong angle before realizing his mistake and going in the right direction, which left a pretty big mark for us to study. These copper saws came in three basic styles. One was a two-person saw, like an old-time lumber saw. Another type was a small, handheld saw with a wooden handle. And finally, there was a tubular saw for making holes in granite and other stones. These saws are depicted in several Egyptian reliefs. Interestingly, they didn't require saw teeth to work. They only required sand to be placed between the saw and the stones. The sand was what did the cutting. This particular method of stone cutting has been tested by ancient Egyptian tool experts, and not only was it done, but it was apparently quite easy to do. However, sawing granite with copper was expensive because the copper would wear out somewhat quickly. Therefore, you mostly see granite in ancient Egypt being worked with pounding stones, finished with grinders and chisels. The saw work was reserved primarily for royal projects, like that of the sarcophagus. All of this really makes Ancient Aliens lose credibility, because all throughout the series, they make it sound like working with granite was only possible using diamond-tipped alien power tools. But as all this relates to the Great Pyramid's construction, it's important to remember that almost none of the pyramid is made from granite, except for a few things like the roof supports for the king's chamber. Most of the stone was sandstone and limestone. About 85% of the stone used in the construction of the pyramids was relatively soft sandstone, which was quarried right on site. That's right, the Great Pyramid was built right in the middle of a massive sandstone quarry, which was no doubt at least one factor in choosing the location to build it. The other 15% of the stones, like that of limestone and granite, would have to be brought in from a slightly further away location. So this raises another question. What about moving these stones? Surely the only way is by levitation, as Ancient Aliens claims.
In order to really move massive amounts of stone like that, they would have had to have been levitated, somehow made weightless, and then just moved through the air by some kind of device, perhaps even a handheld kind of device, like some beam weapon.
If levitation was the way that the ancient Egyptians moved stones, they had a funny way of showing it, because there are plenty of depictions of them using wooden sleds to move everything from blocks the size and shape of the ones used for the pyramid to massive 1,000-ton monuments and obelisks, all using wooden sleds. They even had a hieroglyph for the word sled, which they used often. In fact, 3 such sleds have been found intact by archaeologists, and they have all kinds of places to attach ropes to. Speaking of ropes, ropes made out of papyrus and other materials have been found in Egypt, some of them with a massive circumference, suggesting that they were used for extremely heavy objects. Boats were used for stones that needed to be imported. In fact, a channel was dug from the Nile to the construction site, so no stone had to be dragged very far anyway. So, what about the construction of the pyramids? How exactly was it done? Part of the reason that the Ancient Aliens perspective is attractive is because some of the other popular theories concerning the pyramid's construction have serious problems, such as the single ramp theory, which would have had to extend out more than a mile and would have had to have more stones in it than the pyramid itself. Another one is the spiral ramp theory. This one is problematic because some of the ledges only had about 2 feet or less to work with. Certainly not enough to hold a ledge that would carry workers and stones the size of the ones used. Also, a structure like the pyramid would have had to have been constantly monitored for geometric accuracy as it progressed upwards, because being even a few inches off on a lower level could cause the top to be off by a huge amount, and a spiral ramp would have made it impossible to survey the geometric accuracy of the pyramid as it progressed. Add to this that there's no actual evidence for either of those theories, and you can see why people are looking for alternatives. While doing research for this documentary, I came across a new theory about the pyramid's construction that I had not heard before. At first I planned to mention it only briefly, but the more I heard of this theory, the more convinced I became of its validity. It was proposed not by an Egyptologist, but by an eccentric French architect named Jean-Pierre Houdin. And if Jean-Pierre is correct, knowing how the blocks were raised in the pyramid also happens to explain some of the other mysteries, like the purpose for the odd-shaped Grand Gallery, as well as the purpose of the granite blocks above the king's chamber, and why there were 3 burial chambers cut at different levels in the pyramid, 2 of which were unused. I will very briefly explain this theory, but I highly encourage you to visit the links at the website on your screen, because the specifics of this theory are something that any pyramid enthusiast should be very familiar with, in my opinion. The basic idea is that there was an internal ramp in the Great Pyramid, and workers dragged the blocks through it until they reached the corners, at which point the block was repositioned for another team to pull it up the next ramp. Also, the exterior limestone blocks with the polished finish would have been positioned and aligned first to ensure geometric accuracy, and then the sandstone blocks would have been positioned behind them as filler. This would mean that all the internal chambers, like the Queen and King's chamber, were built as the pyramid progressed upwards in the light of day. This internal ramp theory, unlike some of the others, is actually supported by quite a lot of physical evidence. For example, in the 1980s, a French team, looking for hidden chambers, conducted a full-scale gravimetric survey of the Great Pyramid, kind of like a giant X-ray map of the entire pyramid. They actually found evidence of this internal ramp through their study, but they had no idea what to think of the spiral pattern they saw at the time, so they simply filed it away until they heard about Jean-Pierre's internal ramp theory 14 years later. In addition, there is this notch high up on the Great Pyramid, which, according to Jean-Pierre, rests exactly on the 7% grade where you would expect to find the internal ramp, and would be at the exact place where the workers would have lifted the blocks and changed the direction for the pullers. Bob Breyer, an Egyptologist who was working with Jean-Pierre, was only allowed a few minutes to survey this notch and take a few pictures and measurements. They found that there was indeed a large space behind these stones, and they made extensive computer models with the pictures that were taken. As of 2012, the team is still waiting for clearance from the Egyptian authorities to conduct a full-scale survey of this notch. But perhaps even more interesting than this is the purpose for the Grand Gallery and the granite stones above the king's chamber. I mention them together because, according to Jean-Pierre, they are intimately connected. First, it's important to know the main difference between the Great Pyramid and the other 2 pyramids at Giza is that the Great Pyramid's burial chamber was inside the pyramid. The other 2 were underground, cut directly into the bedrock, which meant that in those 2 pyramids, they did not have to worry about the hundreds of thousands of tons of stone above it collapsing onto the tomb. The Great Pyramid was different. Its chambers were in the middle of the pyramid, and because of this, the designer had to get creative to prevent the stones from collapsing in on the chambers. In earlier pyramids in the area, this had been accomplished using a stone roof that came together at an apex, which distributed the weight of the blocks away from the chamber. But for the Great Pyramid, the designer wanted to be more ornate, opting for a flat roof in the king's chamber, which would have easily collapsed if he didn't find a way to distribute the weight of the stones above it away from the roof. He ingeniously added a series of large granite blocks, spaced out evenly above the chamber, capping those stones with the same apex roof idea from the earlier pyramids, which distributed the weight safely away from the king's chamber ceiling. This did indeed solve the problem of the weight of the stones collapsing the chamber, but it caused another problem. How could you get those granite stones up there for placement? They would have been too big for the internal ramp and too heavy even at a 7% incline. For the solution, we look to the Grand Gallery. The Grand Gallery has puzzled Egyptologists ever since it was discovered. It's such an odd shape, and it doesn't seem to make sense to construct it the way it's constructed if it's simply a path to get from point A to point B. This has led to much speculation about its purpose. Jean-Pierre has proposed that the Grand Gallery was used as a massive counterweight system, where a wooden trolley was loaded with stones and rigged with ropes, and was used to provide the force to lift the heaviest objects. Basically, it was the equivalent of a freight elevator. There's actually a lot of physical evidence for this too, and it explains all kinds of peculiar details about the Grand Gallery. For example, the odd holes in the so-called benches of the Grand Gallery were used to connect a wooden guide system for the trolley. It also explains why there are remnants of grease as well as scratches along the bottom of the chamber where the trolley would have rubbed against the stone. It was apparently lubricated to make it run smoother. It explains the odd way the stones were worn at the top of the so-called step of the Grand Gallery, exactly where the ropes would have had to be. This area has now been cemented over to make a step, but you can see in the old pictures what it looked like when the first explorers arrived. This freight elevator would have required a small external ramp, which there is some evidence for. And even those who oppose the long single ramp theory agree that there probably was a small ramp at the beginning of the construction. This ramp would have been dismantled after the completion of the king's chamber, and the stones would have been dragged up the internal ramp to finish the rest of the pyramid. Jean-Pierre and his team have made a lot of converts to this idea, including a number of well-respected Egyptologists and pyramid experts. But as of 2012, they are still in the final stages of being approved by the Egyptian government for more work on the site.
Houdin's idea of an internal ramp, I think, is coherent. I think there's good circumstantial evidence for it. If you have watched the National Geographic special on his view, I think you would agree that there is good circumstantial evidence for it. It has a lot of explanatory power for a lot of the fundamental questions. And I think it's important because Houdin's theory depends on a very simple idea in engineering, both in the ancient world and in today's world, and that is the use of weight and counterweight, using the weight of one object to lift an object of greater weight.
Whether or not this theory proves to be perfectly true in every respect will hopefully soon be seen. But I at least hope that by now, most of us can see that these construction techniques are well within the capability of mankind to conceive of and to do without the intervention of aliens.
Eastern Lebanon, the Bekaa Valley. Here, at this archaeological site, stand the ruins of Heliopolis, built in the 4th century BC by Alexander the Great to honor Zeus. But beneath the Corinthian columns and remnants of both Greek and Roman architecture lie the ruins of a site that is much, much older. According to archaeologists, it dates back nearly 9,000 years. The ancient city of Baalbek, named after the early Canaanite deity Baal.
And so because it was already sacred to the god Baal, then later the Greeks and the Romans then would build temples on this very same spot.
Archaeological surveys have revealed that the enormous stone foundation that lies at the base of the site dates back tens of thousands of years. But even more significant to ancient astronaut theorists is their belief that the colossal stone platform may once have served as a landing pad for space travelers.
The idea that ancient aliens will try to convey is that underneath the Roman ruins lies a very old platform that was once used to launch spacecraft. As we watch the next clip, listen for the first thing they cite as evidence for this claim.
But what was originally there before the Roman temple was this spaceport platform that was apparently used for extraterrestrials coming and going on planet Earth.
As evidence, researchers point to the gigantic megalithic stones incorporated into the foundation, each weighing between 800 to 1,200 tons, and perfectly fitted together.
These three stones they're referring to are called the trilithons, and the heaviest of the three is 800 tons, not 1,200 tons as they say. There are two other stones that are heavier than this around the area, but they are unused, still connected to the bedrock in the quarries, and thus are obviously not part of the trilithons. The way the information is presented about these three stones leads the viewer to believe that they are part of the foundation, or platform, of the Baalbek site. What they want the viewer to think is that spacecraft lifted off and landed on the stones of this platform. They also claim that these three stones cannot be of Roman construction, as the mainstream archaeologists believe, but they say that they were part of the earliest structure at the Baalbek site, and that the Greeks and Romans only built on top of this ancient foundation. And it is true that there was a very old pre-Roman temple at this site, but we will learn more about that later. Our focus at the moment is the Trilithon stones. Ancient Alien says that these three stones are the real mystery of Baalbek.
This is the real mystery of Baalbek. How these stones came to be there, why they were placed there, and specifically how they were transported into place. Because some of the stones are of such magnitude that modern machinery is incapable of putting them there. But somehow our ancestors were able to do this.
To solve this mystery, we need to first understand that these three stones do not form the foundation of Baalbek, as is so often suggested. The Trilithon stones lay end to end, or long ways, and are part of the narrow wall on the western end of the complex. They are most certainly not the foundation, nor do they constitute a platform, and it would be very awkward for a spaceship to land on top of them, considering the space on top is so narrow. Ancient Aliens tries to make it seem like no one knows the purpose for these stones, or why they had to be so heavy.
But if the moving, hoisting, and setting of such massive stones was so incredibly difficult, then who, or what, placed them there? And perhaps more importantly, why?
The truth is that the purpose for this wall is very well known by archaeologists. It was a retaining wall. Retaining wall technology really improved with the Greeks because of the importance of the amphitheater in their culture. Because most amphitheaters were sunken into the ground and surrounded by earth, they needed to construct retaining walls to hold back the soil. Then the Romans came along and basically perfected the practice. The rule of thumb in retaining walls, even today, is the bigger and heavier the stones, the better the retaining wall. Also, the stones needed to be in as big of sections as possible. In other words, huge sections of uncut stone. It's no coincidence that some of the biggest single stones in the ancient world, besides Baalbek, are also used in retaining walls, and by the Romans as well, as we will see. Retaining walls were especially important if there was a lot of soil erosion at the site, or if the platform you were trying to build was on a steep incline. At Baalbek, the platform was built right on the side of a huge hill, so for that reason alone, it would require a retaining wall if they intended to make a large level platform. But if you added to that a soil erosion problem, you would have two very good reasons for a huge retaining wall at Baalbek. So does the area around Baalbek have a problem with soil erosion? The answer is yes, probably one of the biggest in the world. You can see evidence of soil erosion all around the Baalbek site. The soil from the top of the hill has been sliding down the hill into the valley below for hundreds of years. One of the leading causes of soil erosion is deforestation. If an area that once had trees has been completely cleared of those trees, the rain no longer will have anything to slow down its velocity. Normally, the rain hits tree branches and the thick foliage that accumulates on the forest floor over time. Also, the soil is kept in check by the root systems of the trees, which hold the soil in place. Lebanon has a picture of a cedar tree on its flag. Their trees have been a symbol of pride for literally millennia, the so-called cedars of Lebanon. But the forests have disappeared long ago, as they were one of the only sites for timber in the ancient Near East, and it was massively deforested in ancient times. In fact, the soil shifting is just as bad today in the Bekaa Valley. The UN in 2006 proposed a series of solutions to deal with this now full-scale environmental disaster in the Baalbek region. Homes in the region are being abandoned as their foundations shift and they become inhabitable. But although these proposed solutions by the UN may be new, this problem is an ancient one. one the Romans would have been well aware of. The massive trilithon stones provided the weight needed to press down and secure the stones in the wall below. This is why you only see these huge stones on one side of Baalbek, the side where the steep slope is. The idea that these stones were part of a platform and were used as a landing pad is something that requires ignorance of the layout of the site in order to believe. Well, what about the age of this wall? Is it from the Roman period of construction, or is it from the pre-Roman Canaanite era? There is a lot of confusion about this point because there was indeed a very old pre-Roman temple on this site. The pre-Roman Canaanite temple was a pretty standard platform and altar, much like other sites built by the Canaanites, which were referred to in the Old Testament as high places. The original site was probably chosen by the Canaanites because it was indeed on a hill, as any good high place should be, but also because it was less than half a mile from the perfect stone quarry. The early versions of this temple, however, did not have a retaining wall. As the different groups added to the site over the years, the site changed drastically. The Romans alone spent 200 years doing construction at the site. Think of that. That would be like starting a construction project in 1812 that only just now came to completion. That's a long time to be working on a project. So yes, Baalbek is built on a very old Canaanite altar to Baal, but the trilithon stones were not part of that site, nor are they part of the foundation as is often claimed. They are part of a very necessary retaining wall. The question still remains, however, about the methods for moving and lifting these stones.
Some have suggested that this stone alone weighs in excess of 1,200 tons. How was it moved there? Because obviously it's situated on top of these stone rows that we can find down here, which means that this stone had to be lifted and then set on top of these stones down here.
So did the Romans have the technology to move and lift such stones? Well, all you have to do is look one country over to find out. About the same time the Romans were beginning their 200-year project at Baalbek, another project of similar magnitude was beginning by the Roman client king Herod the Great in 19 BC. Herod, using Roman techniques, renovated the Temple Mount to earn favor with the Jews, who viewed him as a Roman proxy, not a Jew. The expanded version of the temple was double the size of the original, but in order to make this expansion, he had to incorporate part of the hill to the northeast, which meant that he had to construct a massive retaining wall in order to hold back the force of the earth in order to build the massive platform. There is a portion of this retaining wall still standing today, and it contains the second largest set of single stones next to Baalbek. Just like Baalbek, there are several of these stones lined up to form the wall and to provide the weight and size needed to hold back the earth. They call the four largest stones the master course. The weight of the heaviest one is 600.
All right, I'm going to get out of here for a while.